Good afternoon, everyone. This is me, Gaia, the Professor of Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience, who's been leading the project called The One, focused on supporting professionals just like yourselves in learning about how to support their young children's numeracy. As part of our collaborations with the Strongest Practice Hubs and the London South the Strongest Practice Hubs in particular, I offered a webinar for your members earlier in the summer, and I'm now able to share that recording with you. So I hope you enjoy it. And unfortunately, you can't ask questions at the moment because this is just a recording, but please feel free to write to me via the London South Strong Practice Hubs if you have any further questions. So let me just share my screen. Go. So the early years are, of course, absolutely a crucial period for young children's learning in many, many ways. And interestingly, today, therefore, we're going to focus on a set of early years skills that maybe you've learned less about as part of your professional development: executive functions and why they matters in early years maths, giving you some practical ideas about how to improve them, but also another set of skills that, again, more rarely are trained in the context of professional development in the early years: space and shape, and why they matter for early years maths, but also, again, some practical ideas on how we might support our young children in learning about them. So let's start off with executive functions. And here I acknowledge my colleagues who've been really, really helpful in making me think about how important it is to share with educators why executive functions are important thinking skills in the early years. So the Department for Education, for example, are starting to recognize the importance of executive functions in the early years. And for example, they appear in Development Matters as one of the 7 key features of effective practice, that we should focus on understanding self-regulation and executive function and what those skills are. And I'll return to that point in a moment. The Best Start in Life Part 1, also published by the Ofsted Research Reviews, highlights the role of executive functions. And with colleagues, we've written about how this is really important to understand, but at the same time, how important it is not to study executive functions in isolation and think of them as if they were standalone skills, because they're always applied to something. And for example, they're very heavily applied to mathematics in the early years. For example, you might be working with your young child and giving her instructions in your classroom. Use the blocks to make a big tower, and then let's see who has the tallest tower. And once you're done with the activity, okay, time to tidy up. Well, that little girl has to hold information in mind. She has to inhibit distractions, for example, wanting to play with her friend. She has to think flexibly because that's required when she has to shift away from playing to tidying up. And she has to pay attention to the instructions and focus on the task at hand. And all of these are executive functions that are very rapidly developing in the periods from birth to 5 years of age, and even before then, from 0 to 3. And Alex, my colleague Alex Hendry, has written a very nice review piece that's very accessible on this idea. Now, a lot of research evidence has shown that children with the strongest EF have the strongest numeracy skills in primary school, but also in preschool. And for example, just to give you a sense of where these data come from, I was involved in a study based in the UK where we worked with children and their nurseries and parents, and these were children who were all in the year before entering reception. We saw them twice, about 5 months apart, in 13 settings in Oxfordshire just before they entered school, with a number of games that get at their early number understanding, and here is one of them. I'll tell you more about them in a moment, but also games that looked at their executive function skills. And at the same time, we worked with educators to discuss what they felt was needed in the classroom and observe their good practice in the classroom. So what did we find? When we used our traditional games that are fun but measure executive functions and numeracy, we found that children with the strongest executive functions had the strongest maths. We also found that children with the strongest executive functions had the strongest later maths and also growth in maths. And this is consistent with the evidence that I was telling you about from other countries and from primary school. But also, and really important in that first collaboration with educators in the classroom flagged that they wanted more professional development in the early years in mathematics. And in the classrooms, in the preschool classrooms, where educators used the broadest maths language. They talked about space, they talked about number, they talked about processing and ordering. Cardinality counting and number naming were strongest for the children in those classrooms. So what can we do to help all educators really foster both executive functions and in the early years? We've been working on a program that is called Orchestrating Numeracy in the Executive, and worked in collaboration with the Stronger Practice Hub, including the London South Practice Hub, to bring together executive functions and numeracy, working to develop, to co-produce with educators a play-based curriculum intervention that is inclusive of all children, and that brings children and educators to practice executive challenge in maths. What do we mean by that? Too little executive challenge in maths will probably mean not a very engaging task, boredom, and therefore poor learning. Executive challenge in maths might mean failure. This task, this number game is now too difficult, and therefore children won't learn. And it's really hitting that sweet spot of executive challenge and adapt it to children who are diverse in your classrooms that really matters. And that's what we've been trying to do, supporting educators. Now we're now building on the collaboration that started with settings in Oxfordshire, where we worked with pilot settings, but also some co-development feasibility settings, and about 200 children. What did we do? Well, we worked on co-producing educator professional development. I'll tell you a little bit more in a moment about some sessions in which we focused on learning about EF and number. We then gave some practical ideas about how to foster those skills in the context of play. And then we observed what happened in the classrooms at the end of the 12 weeks, and had evaluation interviews with the educators to find out whether there were barriers, what they found good, what they found less good about the program. We also observed educators at the beginning to understand really the excellent practice that goes on in early years preschools, and Amy was involved with that. But we also assessed the children before and after the intervention in their numeracy, and we follow them up again at the end of reception. We then analysed all the data, and there are very, very many lessons learned. First of all, that educators in the early years are a very broad spectrum of professionals, with some with a huge amount of experience in the early years, and some who have just started. And so it's really important to take this diversity in mind. The highest level of qualification varies across in the context of early years settings, and also the availability of time for planning. Some educators have time to plan and some have none at all. So when designing the intervention like the one, we really need to think about it being not time consuming, not technical, but also not patronizing to the expertise in the room. Accessible, interesting, and fun for sure. So our professional development was composed of 4 sessions that discussed, first of all, the expertise in the room, then discussed executive functions in maths, then maths again, and then bringing them together. So let's talk about executive functions then. Well, working memory, inhibitory control, and flexible thinking are the 3 key pillars of executive functions. Executive functions help children remember and process information over a short period of time, and this skill is known as working memory. So in a game, for example, like the adult is playing with the child, and she makes a shape, and then she covers it, and then asks the child, "Can you make a shape just like mine?" This requires memory is key in maths. I need to remember the numbers that I've just seen or heard. I need to keep the numbers in my brain while I process them. I need to remember instructions and strategies, and that's a key element. Working memory is a key element of early years maths, even before children get to primary school. In addition to that, executive functions help children avoid temptation and ignore irrelevant information. And this skill is known as inhibitory control. So, for example, you may know about a famous study, a set of studies asking 4-year-olds not to touch a marshmallow in order to receive 2 marshmallows after a period. And here you see this little boy who's trying to find all sorts of strategies to ignore the marshmallow and ignore it in order to achieve the goal of getting 2. Now, inhibitory control is also important in maths. That's because, one, first of all, you need to avoid temptation to talk to one's friends when learning, but also mathematical material involves inhibitory control. For example, we might need to ignore area and really think about number. For example, if I asked you, which is more, one elephant or four mice? If you think about area, you think elephant. Actually, if you think about numerosity, you should be saying mice. And therefore, thinking skill that's crucial in the early years is thinking flexibly and switching between tasks. And this skill is called flexible thinking or cognitive flexibility. Now, children switch readily in their ability to think as they move from one task to the other. And for example, in this game, which we propose as part of the one, we ask children to try and fit different shapes into a frame. And that's a game that requires them to think really flexibly about shapes and placing them. Now, flexible thinking is key in the context of maths, because I need to understand, for example, that there are very many ways of representing a particular number. Yes, there's the numeral 6, but also the dice face with 6 dots, 6 marbles, and they all mean the same thing, 6. One might need to switch between one activity and the other, counting forward or counting backwards, adding or subtracting numbers. And so these are skills that are key in early years classroom. But not only that, executive demands in the primary and the preschool classrooms are very high. As you can see here, a preschool classroom is very busy. There are a lot of things happening in terms of sound, in terms of vision, so inhibitory control is required. And in this lesson, that's all about African instruments, you can see that many children in the classroom are really engaged. Some are wanting to ask questions, therefore holding their thoughts in mind, and others may be paying attention to something completely different. So executive skills are required when doing maths, and so it's really important to think about what executive demands we're making of children, even when they're playing very simple early years games. Adding executive challenge, so long as it's not catastrophic, it's not too much, the executive challenge, really fosters deep thinking about the material, and that results in better learning. And that's why we really work with educators and not removing challenge completely, but thinking about what that executive challenge is, and then getting to the sweet spot which really fosters good learning. So, for example, can you add working memory challenge to a game? Here is a game that asks children to find one leaf, or maybe you now ask to find 2 leaves or 3 leaves. You can add a countdown between instructions. You can't go until I've done the countdown. 3, 2, 1, go. So you have to maintain working memory those instructions. You can give more complicated or less familiar things to remember. Can you find the big spiky leaf rather than just any leaf? And that requires flexible thinking. Maybe you can give more items to remember. Can you find 2 leaves and a stick? That again increases challenge. You are the best people at knowing where your children are at in terms of their maths knowledge, and therefore what kind of challenge might be appropriate to add or not. We can add inhibitory control challenge to activities. For example, you can avoid doing something, ask to avoid doing something, so only look for green leaves, not orange leaves. Or you can ask children to do something different to what they're used to doing, for example, count the leaves backwards. And flexible thinking can also be involved. Ideas are like switching between tasks and goals, finding and sorting leaves, not only finding them, but also sorting them. Switching between tasks that are different kinds. So let's find and sort the leaves by color, but now we can sort the leaves by size. And that is definitely a flexible thinking idea. You can also use lots of different ways of using materials in different ways. For example, counting the leaves or using the leaves to make a picture, and then again requires and fosters flexible thinking. Now, everyday games absolutely build in flexible challenge. And here is an example of a favorite and a classic. What's the time, Mr. Wolf? It requires maths and executive function skills. Now, if we had a live session here, I would ask you lots of questions about your thoughts, and then I'll give you in your recording a little bit of time, if you want to pause it, to think what kind of maths challenges and what kind of executive skills does What's the Time, Mr. Wolf require? And how might we build more executive challenge once our children are really comfortable with the activity and are ready to have fun and learn more by embedding more challenge? This idea of executive challenge, therefore, to practice, to be at the level of comfort, and then progress to progressively add a little more challenge, results in deeper learning. That's what we call PCP. Now, let's take a little break now, and I will return for the recording in a moment. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll take a pause and then we'll talk about shapes and space shortly. Excellent. So I hope you had a lovely break, and we return to this session to think about another set of skills that are super important in the context of early years maths, and those are shapes and space. Here we go. Now, there's more to mathematics than counting alone is something that we all know in the classroom, and yet there are really interesting observations in primary school. For example, educators and teachers are coming to reflect on how spatial thinking seems to be a missing piece in mathematics curriculum. And also interventions from 3 years of age that show that improving spatial skills improves mathematics. So we really need to know about spatial skills in the context of number and numeracy in the early years. So let's talk about space then, exploring shapes. Now these are some practical activities of how you might explore shapes in the early years classroom. Here is one of our games. You give lots of cardboard shapes to children in a frame of the size that you want and you like. You can make it with tape, and then you ask children to try and fit as many shapes in here as possible. That requires thinking about shapes. But there are also everyday activities like having snack time that really can help us think about shapes. What shapes are the pieces of fruit that we're having? What shapes are the things that we see in the classroom? Curvy, straight, pointy, long, short, wide. This spatial language in practice can really support children thinking about space. We can add a little bit of extra challenge by, for example, modifying shapes and cutting them in half to turn, for example, a circle into a semicircle or a square into 2 triangles, right? That's that really fun additional element of challenge. Understanding space in practice requires adults around you using spatial language all the time. And what's that spatial language? For example, they're prepositions, thinking about using words like under, over, between. Where is the object? And is it next to or onto? Rather than, therefore, just using there, but rather using spatial language to describe where objects are. And first modeling it really nicely to children, but then asking them to use their own words to tell you where objects are in the world. You can then add extra challenge, for example, thinking about space and counting together. How many steps is it to get to the climbing frame? Where is the climbing frame? Is it next to the stepping stones? And so combining the two can help. Now, we're at the point where we are putting these ideas in practice with lots and lots of educators at Stronger Practice Hubs all over the country, including London. And so we're really now seeing settings in the waitlist arm of our trial, and we'll find out in July of this year whether there are big benefits of putting executive functions into maths in practice, like I've described. I really hope that we will be able to find out whether that's the case or not. And we'll definitely, you will hear about the findings, because when they get published by the Education Endowment Foundation in July, we'll share the findings with the Stronger Practice Hubs. But in the meantime, thank you so much for paying attention to my definition of why paying attention to thinking skills like executive functions is important, and then why space and shape are also key in the early years. I've given you some practical ideas. Many of my collaborators and colleagues are coming to see you in your schools in the London South Stronger Practice Hubs, and we hope to see you soon at one of your events. Thank you very much for your time. And please don't hesitate to send questions in. I'm sure Nicola will share them with me. Thank you.